Hello, and welcome to the ACR Journals on Air podcast. I'm your host, Vicky Shamagam. I'm excited to introduce today's podcast manuscript because, like many good things in life, it comes from the great state of Kansas. Now, in the interest of full disclosure, some of my listeners may know that I'm rather fond of this square state in the middle of flyover country because my husband was born there, grew up there, and indeed, we got married in Lawrence, Kansas. Not only that, but we're raising 3 boys who all consider themselves Jayhawks and are dedicated Patrick Mahomes fans. However, the Kansas export we will discuss today is even more forward-thinking than Patrick Mahomes. We're going to be talking about Forward, which is the National Databank for Rheumatic Diseases. Fred Wolf, a rheumatologist in Wichita, Kansas, established this now colossal database. It is arguably the largest, most comprehensive, and most up-to-date database of patients with rheumatic disease in the United States. It is a non-profit organization, predominantly funded through independent research projects for private clients, including pharmaceutical companies and company safety registries. It was established in 1998 and includes data on thousands of patients with rheumatic diseases. More than 30,000 patients are now enrolled, and information is collected that allows investigators to measure the effectiveness and adverse effects of therapies and identify factors that influence and predict outcomes in rheumatic disease. The manuscript we're going to be discussing today is Sleep Disorders Among Individuals with Rheumatoid Arthritis, which was recently published in Arthritis Care and Research, and a link to the manuscript is in our show notes from today. My guest today is Dr. Patricia Katz. Dr. Katz is a professor of medicine at the University of California in San Francisco. She is a master of the American College of Rheumatology, Association of Rheumatology Professionals, a distinguished scholar, and has been editor of a number of our rheumatology journals, including most recently ACR Open Rheumatology. Welcome to the show, Patty.
Thanks, Vicky. I'm glad to be here.
So I wanted to start, Patty, if you don't mind, by having you tell us about your involvement with the Forward Databank. Where does the data in the Forward Databank come from, and how do investigators access that data?
I became involved with the Forward Databank, I believe it was in 2015. Caleb Mishu, who was the associate director with Dr. Wolf for a while and is now the director of Forward, asked me to become involved primarily to deal with the lupus component of the databank. And that's been my primary involvement, even though this paper is about rheumatoid arthritis. The data from Forward comes from patients. There are questionnaires that go out every 6 months, and they're actually very extensive questions about healthcare utilization, health, comorbidities, a lot of disease-specific outcomes, and if there are hospitalizations, those are followed up on. That's primarily the source. Investigators can apply to use the data if you go to the Forward website, which is forwarddatabank.org. There's a way to link to request access. It's readily available to people who want to collaborate.
Yeah, and it is a mix of rheumatic diseases in this data bank, right? So lots of patients with RA and lupus, but also fibromyalgia, seronegatives, a good mix of rheumatologic diseases.
Right. OA, there's a new cohort with gout and psoriatic arthritis. So it's really a grab bag.
Yeah, and uniquely patient reported, right? So patients essentially decide, are they or aren't they going to be involved with the data bank, and then all the data is essentially patient reported. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
So tell us about this particular study that was looking at sleep disorders in patients with rheumatoid arthritis. You used data from a questionnaire issued back in 2016 that specifically asked about sleep symptoms. Could you tell us what was evaluated in this questionnaire?
We added questions to evaluate the diagnosis or symptoms of obstructive sleep apnea, of restless leg syndrome. And we also administered a scale called the Medical Outcome Study Sleep Scale. And it allows the calculation of several subscales. The one we used here was the Sleep Problems Index, which is a measure of sleep quality. It also asked people to report how many hours a night they sleep. So we were able to calculate short sleep from that. So we had a fairly broad number of outcomes that we looked at.
And so all the patients in the registry, so those with rheumatoid arthritis, but also those with other rheumatic diseases, completed this questionnaire. You're reporting here in this manuscript predominantly the patients with rheumatoid arthritis. Can you tell us a little bit about those RA patients, their demographics, disease activity?
Sure. We had a sample of 4,200 people in this paper. The average age was about 65, so they're older than some RA cohorts. And going along with that, the disease duration was also fairly long, about 20 plus years. It's primarily a white cohort, well educated, and there are other characteristics which relevant to sleep. Over a third are obese because obesity is often associated with sleep problems.
They had relatively well-controlled disease activity.
I think based on the ratings of disease activity, I think that's true. This is all, again, patient reported. So the average pain rating on a scale of 0 to 10 was 3.5, so fairly low. We used the Rheumatoid Arthritis Disease Activity Index for disease activity, and it ranges from about 0 to 10, and the average score was 2.4, so fairly well controlled.
And these are predominantly patients being treated in community settings, is that right? So I guess sort of established RA, treated in community settings, relatively well-controlled disease. What did you find in regards to their sleep?
Interestingly, we found that almost two-thirds of the cohort met criteria for at least one sleep disorder. The most common one was short sleep. And if we define that as less than 6 hours, which is a less amount of sleep than the CDC would call short sleep, we had over 40% reported sleeping less than an average of 6 hours a night. And compare that to the population of people who are age 65 and older, it's about 26%. So it's considerably higher.
Yeah, interesting. And so I think you had a couple hypotheses that you raise in the paper as to why these patients with RA might exhibit sleep disturbances, and then why sleep disturbance might correlate perhaps with RA symptoms. I wondered if you could share those with us.
Sure. Before I do that, I'll just sort of mention the prevalence of some of the other sleep conditions. We had over 20% who had either a diagnosis or met symptom criteria for obstructive sleep apnea, and over about 30% who had restless legs. So, why people might exhibit sleep disturbances is a really good question, and I don't think anybody really knows the answer. My hypotheses were that it could be related to disease activity, and we did find that in the results. So people who have more pain are likely to be more restless in their sleep, and they might be awake more often. They might get less sleep overall. There's also the issue that a lot of people with RA might be napping during the day and napping during the day because they're fatigued. It's like a vicious cycle. You nap during the day and then you can't sleep as well at night. And that's a not a that that just it's sort of one feeds on the other. But there are also, I think, perhaps some biological reasons. Insomnia in general is associated with dysfunction in the circadian rhythms of IL-6 and TNF alpha, which are both implicated in RA. So there is a possibility that some of those sleep disorders that we're seeing might be either caused by or lead to disruptions in the circadian rhythms of these cytokines. My guess is that they're more of a cause of the sleep disruptions, just because there have been data that show that, for instance, the peak of IL-6 is later in people with RA than it is in the normal population, but it still might amplify some of the symptoms that we see.
That's interesting. And I guess so. I don't know how much you can pull from the data set you have here in Forward, but you do have some information on medication use. And so, in particular, I think in this study, you were able to show that there wasn't an association between these sleep disturbances and glucocorticoid use. Is that correct?
That is correct in the multivariate analysis. When we looked at just the simple differences in people with and without the various sleep conditions and their use of glucocorticoids, we did see that there were differences. But when we controlled for all the things in the multivariate model, primarily disease activity, pain, and some of the comorbidities, that difference was no longer seen.
Interesting. I guess I'm kind of fascinated. You had this cohort of people with RA, but you obviously have data on patients with other diseases too. Did you look at all at those other groups of patients, or have you looked in other data sets at sleep disturbances in other diseases?
I did. This was it was an issue of how much data you could actually put in one paper, and so I limited this to RA. I plan to also do the similar analysis out of this data set with lupus and OA, but it's this issue. How do you slice the pie so it's digestible?
Yeah, I'm excited to see what you find in other diseases too. And I do feel like this is a unique data set for evaluating that just, simply because it's, data that comes directly from the patients, like the reverse of direct consumer advertising. This is the patients telling us there's a problem, ignore it at our peril.
Yeah. I think that's a good point because there's really robust evidence of the negative impact of sleep problems on health in general. I mean, it's associated with cardiovascular disease and cognitive decline and depression and lower pain thresholds. And all these things are really important in RA and other rheumatic diseases as well. So I think it really is something that needs more attention.
Yeah, I agree. And it's great to have some data to support that because I do feel it's something that it really does impact quality of life for our patients. And so it's nice to know that there is data that tells us that's true. I'm going to switch topics for a little bit because, as you probably know, we like to spend a few minutes in this podcast letting our audience hear a little bit about the people behind the papers. You are obviously a very accomplished and successful scientist. You've won numerous awards for your work, including Lifetime Achievement Awards and the President's Award at the ARP. Would you mind sharing with our listeners how you got your start, both in research and specifically in the rheumatology field?
Well, it was really coincidental. I had been living in Chicago and was moving to San Francisco with my now ex-husband and I needed a job. And so I had been working with a group of various groups of committees, and one of the committee members was on the faculty at UCSF. Now, granted, this was 30 plus years ago, so everything was not online. And I asked him to send me the job listings, and there was a job listing for a research assistant at UCSF, and I applied for it, and I've been there since 1986.
Fabulous.
First as a research assistant, and then transitioned to a faculty appointment.
Yeah, that's great. And so I feel like, sometimes these connections that you think are, connections through committee work and other things sometimes are really life-changing for people. So it's nice to hear. At any point during your career, I appreciate this is asking you to share a little bit. Did you ever have any points where you got stuck or felt like you couldn't quite figure out how to move forward? And if so, what kept you going?
That's also a really good question because there have been many times when I've gotten stuck. Just as an example, I have just finished an R01 that was dealing with sleep and RA. We haven't published the data yet, but I submitted that application 6 times before it got funded. So with changes every time, but I thought it was important, so I just kept plugging away. There have been times where funding streams were very tight. And I will confess that at one point I was actually thinking maybe I should go to school to learn to be a plumber because they would always be work. But fortunately, the funding came through and things have smoothed out a bit. But it's always been difficult when you live your life from grant to grant or grants to grants.
Yeah, and I feel like sometimes you do think, gosh, should I completely pivot? What's the best way forward? So it sounds like your advice was if you're passionate about something, just keep sticking with it and keep moving forwards. Is that right?
Yeah, persistence.
And
Sometimes
so,
if you have an unusual idea, sometimes it takes the rest of the world a while to catch up to you.
but it takes some confidence to keep going while you're wondering why no one else can see the merits of your good idea, right?
Right, right.
So now this next question, I don't want you to take it the wrong way, but I couldn't help but notice the manuscript we were just discussing. The questionnaire was sent out and distributed to the patients back in 2016. The manuscript just published now, so more than 6 years later. I wondered, was the delay related to the analysis just taking you a long time, or did you, have struggles? The manuscript kept being pushed back to the back burner. You're obviously very prolific in your writing and in your work, and so I can't ever imagine you having writer's block. But do you have any advice for academics who perhaps struggle with writing and getting the manuscript out of the door? What practices have helped you over the years?
The tables for this manuscript were done probably 2 years before I actually got the manuscript done, because writing is hard for me. I just admit that. I can write the methods and the results and the tables, and doing the discussion and the introduction takes me forever. So it's helpful for me to have some external accountability sometimes, to have collaborators and or say, I'm going to get this to you by X date, because I do get stuck. This one, I probably redid the way I was going to present the data a half a dozen ways, half a dozen times. So I would say that even after all this time, it's still sometimes a process. Sometimes it's easier, but sometimes it takes several iterations.
Yeah. Do you have any tips for our fellow rheumatologists who struggle similarly with writing? Are there any practices you use that just keep you accountable or keep you writing even when the days are hard?
Sometimes I find it helpful just to walk away and come back to it, because I need to clear my head. I have a list of probably a dozen papers on my desk that I plan to get to. I'm probably not the best person to offer tips in terms of time management or manuscript management. Like I said, I think it's helpful to have some sort of external accountability, whether it's a collaborator or if you're a younger person, maybe your mentor is going to set your deadlines. But unfortunately, when you get to be a senior investigator, you have to set your own deadlines, and you can wiggle with them a little more. So
Yeah.
it's still
Personal
hard.
accountability is always hard. I
Yeah,
actually, I will confess, sometimes found it quite helpful to have a student accountability, right? If I promised something to one of my students or one of my mentees, I would always get it done, right? I was good at getting it done for people that were looking for help.
right. And I'm much better at meeting that kind of deadline than I am meeting my own personal deadlines, because I feel some obligation. If I've got a student or a fellow who's trying to get a paper out, at this point they're newer in their career than I am. They need to move things through with a little bit more urgency than I feel I do at this point. So maybe that's right, maybe it's not, but
I think it's all helpful. I think the struggle is real and many people do share it. And so it's helpful for us to hear some of the tricks that have worked for you, for sure. Now, as a senior academic, you obviously have lots of experience reviewing and editing manuscripts, and you're now one of the editors for ACR Open Rheumatology. I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about that journal. So, what are the editors looking for in ACR Open Rheumatology, and what's the editorial process for manuscripts that are submitted?
ACR Open Rheumatology is different from both ANR and ACNR because we cover the whole waterfront of research, from very basic science to health services research and epidemiology. So we're really open to anything. It's been an interesting process starting a new journal. When I was Ed Yellen and I were the editors for ACNR, and that was an established journal, and we had a big growth period during our editorship. But ACR Open was like growing something from the ground up, and I think we've been relatively successful. We are open to, like I said, topic areas across the board, In rheumatology, one of the advantages is that because it's an open journal, if you have a manuscript that has a ton of tables or visual materials, it's a great outlet because it's all online. It's also open access. So that's also helpful for a lot of people who need that venue for their funders. And the original intent was to give authors another publication venue that was part of the ACR. Just because ANR and ACNR only have so many pages, we have much more available virtual space. So that's another advantage. So we're eager to accept things as new direct submissions. We also take transfers from both of the other journals.
And do you have any kind of pointers as to the review and editorial process? Any tips for our budding authors who might be listening?
Yeah, I think that in terms of tips for authors, they're pretty much the same that I would give for any paper. It's be clear, be concise, be accurate. Your tables and figures should be relevant. The one thing is I would ask people to be patient with the review process these days. It seems to be harder for all of us to get reviewers.
Yeah.
So if you're listening, please review when we ask you.
That's
it'll
true.
It'll make it better for everybody. I think it's the same as it is for any journal. Like I said, the only real difference is the amount of material that we can put in a paper, which doesn't mean you should be excessively wordy, but we can accept things that happen in more depth. We just published the systematic reviews that supported the new vasculitis guidelines. And we were able to publish those. They're long, but we were able to publish them because we've got plenty of space, and space is virtual. It's there are no limitations.
Yeah. No, that's good to know. And I feel like there are manuscripts like that just are obviously extensive, deep, with large amounts of data. And this might be a good venue for those.
And if, for instance, educational materials might be another good thing for us to send to us.
Great. So, Patty, thank you. I think that's incredibly helpful for our listeners. I want to thank you again for joining us today to discuss this manuscript and to share your insights on science, writing, and the editorial process. In this episode, I think I wanted to extend a special shout out to the patients enrolled in the Forward Databank. These patients contribute uniquely to understanding rheumatic diseases and are genuinely paying it forward. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all for listening to this podcast. ACR Journals on Air is a production of the American College of Rheumatology. Please follow @ACRheum on social media and rate and subscribe to our podcast at acrjournalsonair.org or wherever you get your podcasts.